Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
Hello, old sports. Welcome back to the Hello, Old Sports podcast here on the Sports History Network. This is Dan Newman, and I would like to welcome you and thank you once again for joining us into our weekly travel back into the history of sports. I am joined, as always, by my co-host and brother, Andrew Newman. Andrew, how are you today?
I'm all right, Dan. Kind of when we started this, we made it a point that, we didn't want this to be an echo chamber and just sort of only wanting to hear viewpoints that we agree with or appreciate or even respect. So I understand what we're doing tonight. I understand why it's necessary. I'm trying to keep an open mind for the good of the show. I certainly don't support the Nets. I don't respect them. I personally find them offensive, but we'll, enter things with the spirit of charity. It is, after all, April. I don't know what that means, but yes. No, my issues are far more with the current Nets than the Nets that we'll be talking about tonight. So I'm doing well.
Good to hear. So before we begin, just a quick reminder to everybody, please follow us on iTunes, give the show a rating, leave us a comment. If you want to engage with us on social media, you can find us at Hello Old Sports Podcast. You can email the show at hellooldsports@gmail.com. You can also check us out leave a comment on the Sports History Network website. We've gotten requests for an episode on the 1959 Go-Go White Sox from a listener. So we'd like to thank you for suggesting that. And that's something you can expect, at some point in the spring, most likely. Encourage you also to listen to the other great shows on the Sports History Network: football, baseball, basketball. We're adding new shows every couple of weeks. So give us a listen on there. Andrew and I guested on some different shows throughout the last few months, so we've enjoyed that. All right. Well, tonight's show is about sort of the stepchild of the New York NBA scene. New York Nets became the New Jersey Nets, who then became the Brooklyn Nets, and were almost the New Jersey Swamp Rays for a brief period of time. And Swamp Dragons.
Yeah.
Swamp Dragons. You may have heard an extra voice there. We have with us today my good friend and Nets fan, New Jersey native, Abe Evans-El. Abe, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Oh, yes, no problem. When you reached out to me and said, hey, we're going to do an episode on the New Jersey Nets, I was like, oh boy, do I have something to say about that.
We want to kind of talk about, obviously talking about the whole history of the franchise would be long, and even though we go long here, that would be a little too long. Andrew and I talked a decent amount, or at least some, we've talked about the sort of the New York version of the Nets a few times through when different topics have come up, whether it was when we did our all-time NBA starting fives, whether it was when we did the very first episode when we talked about the Mount Rushmore of sports, and we talked about, Dr. J, among others, who might fit in on the basketball side of that. So we've talked a little bit about the early days of the Nets, and this will likely air sometime in early May. By that point, the NBA playoffs will be heating up. And Andrew, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, the NBA season goes until May 16th this year, so.
No,
that's right. They're screwed. They're on that screwy schedule this year.
My editing is going slowly, but not that slowly. So hopefully by the first week of May, we'll have this up. Heard his voice a couple times. So let me formally say hello and welcome our guest. Abe, thanks again for doing this.
Oh, yes. Thanks for having me. This is exciting. As I told my wife, I'm doing a podcast tonight. And she was like, you're doing what? And it's like, we're going to go talk sports with the Newmans. So.
That was actually one of our potential names was Talking Sports with the Newmans, or like Newman Old Sports or something. So we got a little more generic. So before we turn it over to Abe, and before we kind of get started here, I remember sort of a couple things really quick about the Nets from sort of the late 80s, early 90s. The first season I really got into the Knicks was 88, 89. The Knicks played basically every game on MSG Network, and the Nets played every game on Sports Channel, which was this the other station. And for whatever reason, we didn't get Sports Channel at our house. I don't know whether it was a different package or whether it was just, we couldn't get it there at all. But so I remember, as my little 6-year-old self, there was one Knick game where they played the Nets, and the game was on Sports Channel. And I could not comprehend why, the Knicks were not on their normal channel. And my dad kind of had to explain to me, like, well, the Nets, they're technically considered a New York team also. And then all I remember is that the Knicks lost that game to the Nets by like 20 points. And my dad just saying to me, they shouldn't be losing to the Nets. The Nets stink. And it was just, and I remember those were the teams of sort of Buck Williams and Dennis Hobson and Lester Connor. And these were kind of the late 80s when they still had the red, white, and blue jerseys. So
those were great jerseys.
Yeah, and they've gone back to them once in a while as like a throwback type of thing, even since they've been in Brooklyn. But yeah, those were great. And then it's sort of, I think where we want to pick this up is, with kind of the 90s teams, sort of the teams immediately following those teams. So Abe, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background with the team and how you became a Nets fan growing up?
Oh, yeah. This is kind of completely random. I was born in Chicago. I moved to Richmond when I was like in the first or second grade, right? And I lived there for a few years, and then we moved to New Jersey. Before I moved to New Jersey, wasn't a follower of basketball at all, right? I followed baseball. I was a sort of a closet Braves fan, because that was what the local team for Richmond was. The Braves. It was the closest team. It was on TV all the time. So watched a ton of great pitching in the mid 90s, right? Really exciting stuff. But never really watched a ton of basketball. Then I moved to Jersey, and I moved to Irvington, New Jersey, which is right next to Newark, New Jersey, which is a short train ride away from New York, a big basketball sort of area, right? All the kids sort of played basketball, were super into basketball. And I was like, well, okay, there's something here. I'll watch some basketball, but there's a local team. Why don't I just watch the Nets? As you're a kid, you're in your formative years, and you're like, oh, I live in a state with a basketball team. I'm a fan of this team. And this is before I knew anything really about the Nets. And, come to find out, they just suck. Right. And not like in there's a plan here, that in just an aimless way. They were just bad. And then they would occasionally become kind of okay. And then they would be bad again. And they would make the wrong hires. They would draft the wrong people. Someone would get hurt. And it would just be year after year of suctitude. After a while, right, I went away to college, in the early 2000s, and I was like, oh, I'm still a Nets fan. This is terrible. Like, there were some good games, but there were also a lot of bad ones. And then eventually, right, when I moved to DC, I was like, all right, not only are the Nets no longer in New Jersey, I'm no longer in New Jersey. So I'm going to break free from that, but they still hold a place in my heart. Especially when I think back to those mid 90s teams of Kerry Kittles, Keith Van Horn, terrible draft picks like Iguodala, who I still can't believe they drafted. He played 13 games from or something. I think I have 12 of his rookie cards in the closet here.
One for each game.
One for each, exactly. So, and the funny thing is, I've only been to the Meadowlands once. I feel like me and a friend of mine, my mom got us tickets. They were $4 a piece. It probably cost more in gas to get us there than it did to actually get into the arena. And we're sitting behind the basket, and the stadium is not even half full. And I just remember, I'm super excited because I'm 14 or something. But it was, as the game went on and as they were losing, I was like, I don't think I want to do this again. And so just never went back.
That was actually, Andrew, I don't know if you remember this. That was the first NBA game that we went to was the Nets, and I think it was Sacramento in 1994 or 1995 or something like that.
It was Sacramento, and I've looked up exactly what game it was before. I'm not going to do that right now. if they played the Kings, and the only thing I really remember about the game, that was the Kings era of like Derek Coleman and Kenny Anderson, but I feel like at least one of them didn't play that night. And then the only thing I remember really about the game is that was when the Kings had Bobby Hurley, and he had gotten into a car accident or like a bad accident the year before. And it wasn't his first game back, but it was like one of his early games back. So the crowd gave him a nice hand. And that's, I'll just kind of, I'd written some stuff out because I wasn't sure exactly where we were going to start. But like, okay, the Nets, they kind of bounced around Long Island, settled in the Coliseum. Then for a while they were playing at Rutgers in the late 70s, early 80s. Early 80s, they settled at what was then Meadowlands Arena, Brendan Byrne Arena, Continental Airlines Arena, finally ended up as the Izod Center, and now is just a building that is a ghost town, essentially. They haven't knocked it. I think the real inflection point for the Nets was just when they entered the NBA, getting hammered so much by the financial dealings of what they owed the Knicks for quote-unquote invading their turf. They had to sell Dr. J. And really, but the era we're talking about now, between 1976 and 2002, they only got out of the first round of the playoffs once. So, when we're talking the late 80s, early 90s as a background, they'd have some sort of flare-ups. They hired Chuck Daly, who had very recently been the coach of those Pistons teams. Mm-hmm. They get a 6 seed the one year. They lose in 5 games, but then right after that, Drazen Petrovic is killed in the offseason. To mention what you mentioned with Continental Airlines Arena, just to sort of bring it full circle for anyone who doesn't know, although I think most people are vaguely aware of this at least. So the Nets forever played in the same parking lot, essentially, as where Giant Stadium is. Yep. And now where MetLife is. It was the Devils and Nets both played there. And again, I think most people are familiar with this if you're from the Northeast, if you've ever been to the New York area. It is right off the highway, off the Jersey Turnpike, but it's not. There's no public transportation. There definitely wasn't then. Now there's some trains on Sunday afternoon for Giants games or Jet games, but even those are limited. It wasn't an easy place to get to on a weeknight. It was one thing to get there at 8:30 in the morning for a football game and spend all day and drive and tailgate. If you're trying to go to Nets and, the Bullets in 1991 on a Thursday night and deal with New York City traffic for the privilege of doing it, it's a lot to ask, especially if the team is ghastly. Which a lot of times they were. So, yes, I know we're talking about the Nets, but even those years when the Devils were a dynasty, the Devils were winning cups every year, or not every year, but the Devils were in at least the Eastern Conference Finals every year. They won 3 Stanley Cups. Their attendance still stunk because that wasn't a building you wanted to go to on a weeknight and deal with all of that. So just, again, I know a lot of people know that, but I figured I would just kind of set the stage of just how it was in the New York metropolitan area, but it wasn't easy to get to, so it wasn't really a New York team in terms of being on the transportation hub. So,
I think it's a good point. So Abe, you started sort of in the mid-'90s, right? You said the Kittles, Van Horn years.
Yeah, even before that, right? I didn't get into became very aware of the team, right, with Kittles and Van Horn, especially because at the time I feel like every time the NCAA tournament rolled around, right, Rutgers was still decent around then, so was Seton Hall. So there was always buzz about, this player out of one of these colleges, the other, they'll draft a local kid and they'll bring the Nets, some glory. So around that time, that's when I really sort of started becoming aware of it. I mean, I was around for the Kenny Anderson sort of Ed O'Bannon times, but those weren't great teams. Derek Coleman was okay, right? They were good, but never good enough.
They never made it out of the first round. I think Andrew made the point. Having Chuck Daly, I think, really did something. It kind of drove them up a little bit in the New York consciousness just because of who he was. And it was also this strange kind of thing where you had Riley with the Knicks, and then right around the same time you had Daly with the Nets. And I think a couple of times they played in the playoffs at least once. I think the year that the Knicks won the year the Knicks made the finals, they played the Nets in the first round. I'm looking here at the Daly years. Did Daly only coach the team for 2 years? I guess he only coached
2 years, yeah.
So they lost to Cleveland in the first round in 93, 5-game series. They lost 3-2. So they almost moved on there. They were 43-39. And then they were 45-37 the following year. That's not a bad record. And then Daly was gone after that year. And then that was the beginning of the Butch Beard era, which went on.
I don't even remember that name. I honestly don't even remember that Butch Beard coached the team. I remember John Calipari, who came after him. I do not remember Butch Beard at all. I looked this up, and I was like, who the hell is this guy? I had no idea who this is.
Yeah, I only have sort of vague recollections of it myself. But, yeah, he was, then those teams were not good. The Anderson-Coleman teams were kind of fun, and Petrovic was that kind of guy. But I also think you're right. I think that the Petrovic death really kind of took everything out of it.
He was a genuinely talented. He was really, 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 really good. And right, it's not like you get a hell. What do you even do when like your best player dies?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no rules for that. At least not then. There might be some now.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think it was interesting thing about Petrovic too is that the international thing was just getting started as far as, there's these European, Eastern European guys. I mean, you had Divac, and then, Petrovic was kind of the other one at that point. It was really just, those were the two sort of,
Sabonis would come over or was going to come over around that time. I can't remember when he actually made his way over, but by that point, his knees were shot. By the time he got to the NBA, his knees were shot, but I don't remember what year he came over.
I think Sabonis was late 90s probably. All I remember about Sabonis was him going against all those Laker teams with Shaq, and that was another one where, this was kind of like before everything was available on the internet, and you just would see Sabonis, and he was, he'd mostly just stand out and shoot threes, and he'd, every once in a while he'd like throw a behind the back pass. And I remember just reading one day, because I was 16 or whatever it was, I didn't even know who this guy was, and then all of a sudden you see like, oh yeah, this was one of the best basketball players of all time 10 years ago, and it was just hard to wrap your head around the fact that this old kind of broken down center had been this great player. And then after Daly retires, and I don't know what happened, Daly must have just kind of, because he coached in Orlando after that, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. I think Daly.
Let's see. Yeah, he did. Actually, he came back in '97.
So that must have been one of those situations where he thought he was done. He thought he was too old, but then he got bit by the bug and he wanted to come back. So
yeah.
So they go, and then after this was kind of when they had sort of the down years, the 94, 95, 95, 96. And then Abe mentioned their legendary drafting, and this was kind of about when some of this, starting in like 93, they drafted Rex Walters and then Yinka Dare.
Oh, just a terrible pick. When you think bad NBA picks, I think Yinka Dare most, and I'll tell you this, because not because he was. It'd be one thing if he was a foreign player who never came over, right? Because that's just like we thought we had a guy who was really great in Europe, and he just wouldn't come over. The money wasn't right or whatnot, right? This was a legit. He played in college for, I want to say, 3 or 4 years, and he was awful in college. And they drafted him anyway. And then, lo and behold, he was terrible in the NBA.
So there's a few things about Yinka Dare. He was a local boy, local to you and I, Abe. He played his college ball at GW.
No kidding.
Yeah, played his college ball at GW. And if you go to his basketball reference page, you know how they have, and Andrew and I have had fun with this a little bit in the past, where like sometimes the guy's nicknames will be in parentheses.
Oh, I know what his nickname is. It's Yinka the Stinker.
Yinka Dare.
Yinka Dare.
What was the one that we had it was Kyrie Irving, speaking of Nets.
Wait, Kyrie Irving has a nickname that's not like Mind's Eye or
There was a player on the Sixers in the 70s, I think, and his name was Lloyd Free.
No, it's two different guys.
Wait, that's World Be Free. Yeah. Or is that someone? Yeah.
Lloyd Free and World Be Free are two different guys.
No,
no kidding. Oh, okay.
No, World Be Free was his actual name.
But that wasn't his original name.
Anyway.
Well,
I think World Be Free and Lloyd.
They called Kyrie Irving. The nickname on the website is World Be Flat. Don't ever correct me again. Worldly Free, born Lloyd Bernard Free.
Oh, was I wrong about that?
Yes. Well, I mean, unless there was two Lloyd B. Frees and one of them changed their name to World B. Free.
I thought
Want that to be true.
I thought Lloyd Free and World B. Free were two different guys.
No, he changed his name.
Oh, I thought it was two different guys.
On December 8th, 1981, a day before his 28th birthday, he immediately changed his first name to World. The fellas back in Brownsville gave me the nickname World when I was in junior high. They just started calling me All World, et cetera, et cetera. So,
I thought he had a brother, and the brother was Lloyd, and he was World B. Free. No, I was wrong.
That's back in the day where you could just sign a form and your name was changed. Boom, no problem.
Speaking of back in the day, prior to the internet, we would just argue about this for 3 more years.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just knowing the answer.
So, the other thing about Yankadari, first of all, I remember him being in one commercial for it
vaguely sounds familiar.
Long distance.
Was he like an MCI commercial?
Yeah, it was something like that. It was. All I remember is he was sniffing a flower in part of it, like laying on a bed in pajamas, like sniffing a.
This sounds very, very, very familiar.
Oh no, it was a Puma. Maybe it was a Puma commercial. Maybe we'll try and throw that in the show notes. But the other thing that was weird about him was that he went through basically a whole he didn't have an assist for the first 3 seasons of his career. He had let me pull up his totals here. Okay, his first season he only played 1 game, so whatever, that doesn't count. And then his second season, he played 58 games and he had 0 assists. You'd have to, I think, just get one by accident. You throw it to a guy and he hits a 3, right? I mean,
you would think. And it's crazy. He played 58 games. He averaged 10 minutes a game. This is a what was he, the 14th pick?
Yeah.
Right? It's just a waste of draft capital.
And then Ed O'Bannon was the other one in 95. That I remember when they made that pick. That was supposed to, because he was a guy,
He was a great college player, great
UCLA
player.
For those who don't know, if you enjoyed at one point playing NCAA football or March Madness basketball or any of these video games, you can thank Ed O'Bannon for the fact that you can't play those anymore with real players, because he is the one who sued. I guess he sued the NCAA, or maybe
he sued the NCAA. Yeah,
and he won the case, and so now that's why you can't have. Well, I guess it used to be they never used the names, but they would basically put these guys in the video games.
Yeah, they were enriching themselves off their likeness while making it so that the players couldn't actually get any money. Right? It's basically hey, you're amateurs, but we're going to take your likeness and sell video games with it and pocket the cash.
Yeah, it's who's this number 33 on UCLA who's 7'3"? Is that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? No, that's not him. You don't see his name anywhere, do you? So I mean, honestly, the NCAA probably should have lost that suit, but Ed O'Bannon, and maybe that kind of speaks a little bit to the fact that his legacy as a player was not so great, because if Magic Johnson had won that lawsuit, Magic Johnson would still be better known as a player and not as the guy who ruined NCAA video games for a generation.
I got to push back on the Ed O'Bannon thing a little bit, because that's not what he's trying to do. That's still going on, by the way. He also has got them to rule that the NCAA's practice of barring payments to athletes violated antitrust rules. And so that's why college athletes are allowed to get stipends now, allowed to be enticed with stipends, and why states like California have passed the law that allows college athletes to receive money for their likenesses. He wasn't trying to get them to shut down the NCAA video games. They're, by the way, bringing the football game back.
I totally get. No, he's trying to do probably something really good, I would say. He's trying to get the players to be able to be compensated for this stuff.
Yes, I mean, so, but anyway, I know that's neither here nor there, but he's he wasn't I don't like this, so nobody can have this game. The NCAA was well, if we have to pay somebody, we're just not going to do it. And that's it.
Yeah, no.
Well, yes, they're in the business of not paying their workers. So,
exactly. So it's just kind of a strange time. And then I guess when I remember really things kind of really coming in was, I guess, when they brought in Marbury. That was when well, I mean, is there anything even to say about the Calipari years? I just remember.
So I will say this about the Calipari years. I've been looking through sort of these years, and here's the thing to say about the Calipari years. Don't let John Calipari be your coach and your executive. Just don't do that. Just don't. Full stop.
He was not suited to the NBA. And you get that in both the NBA and at the NFL. You get these guys who aren't suited to the pros. But I think Calipari was sort of uniquely ill-suited. He just, because I just remember later on Rick Pitino kind of came in when Rick Pitino went to Boston.
Oh, yeah, I remember those years.
He'd been decent. He had a couple good years with the Knicks. That was actually that first Knick year that I remember that I was talking about before. He had some good years with the Knicks, Pitino, and then he'd won in Kentucky, and he was sort of like, he was established. I remember after Calipari left the Nets and then went on to his successful college coaching career, about 5 years into it, I remember thinking, is that the same clown that was the coach of the Nets? Because I just remember him being just nothing but a disaster. And I know he had, like, when I say off the court issues, not off the court like his personal conduct, but I know he got into it with reporters and just like he had to apologize for some of the language he used. So this was not a guy who, he didn't even do a halfway decent job. He was just bad. And you're right, I think, for a guy who'd never been an executive or a
NBA coach, they're basically like, well, here you go. It's 2 for the price of 1, right? It's like, wait, we can save a little money by just having the same guy do both of these.
Yeah, just giving a guy like that the keys to the store. His first year was 96, 97. I want to see, I guess some of these guys were gone. Coleman was gone. Anderson, Petrovic obviously had passed away.
Yeah, but O'Bannon was there after first year, right? This was the year they drafted Kittles. Seriously, Jimmy Jackson was on this team? How do I not remember that?
He was written down as sort of the first one. I sort of wrote down, like, as they assembled what would be the team that became the team that went to the finals. And I know they were kind of different teams both years, but Kittles was chronologically the first one. And then obviously the next year that off season would have been when they traded or drafted Keith Van Horn, depending on.
Yeah. I think it was a draft night trade, right, from the 76ers?
His rights were immediately traded, so it was probably one of those like they do now where the pick was made, but they couldn't announce the trade yet.
Yeah.
So the official trade rights were immediately traded to New Jersey along with Michael Cage, Lucius Harris, and Don McClain.
Luscious Lucius. Love that guy.
For draft rights to Tim Thomas and Anthony Parker and player contracts of Jim Jackson and Eric Montrose.
Oh, there you go.
Guys in that trade.
Yeah.
I have 2 main memories of Lucius Harris. One was going to games, and we can talk when we get there about just how many net games I went to my senior year of high school because it was a lot, and how the announcer used to go Lucius Harris, and then in the 03 finals, Lucius Harris had broken his nose, and he had one of the masks on.
Yep.
And at some point in one of the games, he, for whatever reason, decided to take his mask off before he went in the game. And so he goes in the game, and like 20 seconds later, the Spurs call a timeout. And Bill Walton goes, I think the Spurs were so shocked about Lucius Harris not having his mask that they felt the need to call timeout and regroup. I just
that's a Bill Walton announcer ism if I've ever heard one. That's the quality of his announcements, I would say.
So back to the late 90s or the mid to late 90s for a second. I understand why this guy doesn't get talked about as much, but people forget that in sort of the immediate years prior to Marbury, they had another guy who was kind of considered sort of an up and coming star, And that was Jason Williams, not to be confused with either the point guard who played for Sacramento and Memphis and later won a championship with the Heat, or with the Jay Williams went to Duke.
Jay Williams went to Duke and then tore his knee up on a moped.
Mm-hmm. I was actually in Chicago for the first game when I was in college. I happened to be in Chicago for the weekend when Jay Williams had his first game, and he had a really good game in his first game, and all the headlines in the Chicago papers were like, we found our next Jordan, and it didn't really work out that way. But the Nets had the other Jason Williams.
Yeah,
and
I remember this guy.
I think he made an all-star team in like 97 or 98. He was kind of considered sort of like, he was definitely the star of that team for a couple of years. I want to look, when did he, because I think
he joined in 92, 93. Actually. Yeah, he joined in 92, 93, but didn't really. Well, he had like a 3-year run where he was really. Although no, he didn't start. He didn't start until 96, 97. So that would have been and he was an all-star in 97, 98.
Yeah, he had the one good year, and then I think he retired. I think injuries really did it to him, and he was a native New Yorker too. He was. He went to high school. Maybe he wasn't a native New Yorker, but he went to St. John's, and he went to high school at Christ the King, which is this big, always well known as, it's in New York City. It's well known as this big high school basketball school in New York City, sort of historically. So he was kind of a story, and he was very sort of a personable guy. I remember when I was in high school, I went to a basketball camp, and he came and spoke at the basketball camp, and very friendly, and, talked to all the kids and made a big show of, he was leaving. He said, I had such a good time doing this. I can't take money for doing this. And so he kind of gave the check back to the guy who was running the camp. So, a really what seemed like a good guy. And obviously he first had his career cut short because of injuries. And then he had this incident, I think in like 2002, where I think it was his bodyguard that was killed. It was something really.
Oh, yeah, that does ring a bell. There was I don't remember. Yeah,
reading up on this because it's something I hadn't thought of in quite a while. I guess in my head it had always conflated. I thought he was still playing when this happened. Like, not that he was active at the time, but if you had asked me 2 weeks ago, I'd have been like, oh, he was out for the season, but he was still on the Nets when this happened. But I was obviously sort of messing up the timeline because he had been, injuries and cut his career short, and he was gone. But he hadn't been gone that long. He was still very much in the memory of people as New Jersey Nets star Jason Williams. And I think the crux of it was that his limo driver was killed, and then there was an attempted cover-up of it, and he ended up obviously facing serious criminal charges.
Yeah, because I think it was an accidental discharge of a gun or something, and then they tried to play it like he didn't have. Yeah, it was a whole mess. I remember this playing out.
I remember, this is really sort of it's kind of strange, but I was on the mock trial team my first couple years at Boston University, and we had a tournament. You basically had like the one big tournament. There were other little small things, but we had, the one big tournament was always like every February. It was at Princeton, and it was schools from sort of all over the Eastern Seaboard. And our coach was the law, the pre-law dean at BU. And he was the kind of guy who, you didn't tell him he was wrong about things all that often. Whatever the topic, he knew it. So anyway, we were at this tournament, and he's like, oh, I was hoping to catch up with my friend, whoever, who is the coach of I forget what team it was, some team in the New York, New Jersey area, he said, but he ended up having to not be able to come at the last minute because his client is this basketball player, Jason Williams. And apparently there was some sort of an issue over the weekend with a shooting. And so he couldn't make it to coach's team. And I was like, and I had, again, pre-smartphone, pre-internet, blah, blah, blah. And then I got back to my dorm at the end of the weekend after the tournament, and I looked it up, and I was like, oh yeah, no, something did happen with Jason Williams. So I have this sort of two kind of odd, I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to call them personal connections, but two sort of very tangential connections with Jason Williams.
So just so we have the facts right. He was playing with a shotgun while giving a tour of his home. The weapon fired. In April of 2004, he was acquitted of the more serious charges against him, but the court's jury deadlocked on charges of reckless manslaughter. He was convicted on 4 counts relating to trying to cover it up. There was an appeals court. He was able to be recharged, etc. Ended up pleading guilty. This was 2010, but this was still going on. Pleaded guilty to aggravated assault, sentenced to 5 years in prison, parole after 18 months. And apparently he was already in jail for something else at the time. So he had a ton
Yeesh.
that was the most serious of the issues.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think I heard something about him not that long ago. Not something negative. I think something came out like he's trying to make the most of of his life, or turn his life around, or whatever you want to call it. But I feel like I've heard even not all that recently, or not all that long ago, I should say, something about. Oh, he's in the news five days ago for participating in a charity pickleball tournament. So,
oh, there you go.
I'd like to circle back in a minute to the last team he was on, or at least the last team he was on significantly. But just to sort of, and I've been trying to look for this because I was pretty sure I was right about this. But Jason Williams actually plays he's not in it, but Jason Williams is mentioned in one of the most famous scenes of The Sopranos of all time. The FBI, it's an episode in I think the second season, where Tony has been trying to stay away from his regular haunts, and at the very end of the episode, they're all outside of Satriali's, and the FBI comes up, and they kind of have like a few minutes where they're like just shooting the breeze, like they're not mobsters and FBI agents. And the FBI agent says to Tony, he says, "How about those Nets, huh?" And then Tony's lighting up a cigar, and he says, "It's that guy, Williams."
That's right.
Now, I'm pretty sure it was after Jason Williams wasn't on the team, but I was sort of highlighted that last couple of things in that 97-98 era. So that 97-98 team made the playoffs as a 6 seed, I believe, 43-39. Their starting lineup was basically Van Horn, Kittles, Jason Williams, Sam Cassell, and Kendall Gill.
Oh, man.
And another thing that happened in that year that I think a lot of times maybe it's a coincidence, but we talked about this a lot, Dan, in our Tampa sports episode. They changed their uniforms. And, they'd been the various incarnations of red, white, and blue. Immediately prior to this was kind of the weird, like, gradient blue that I don't think anybody was in love with.
Like the baby blue, right? Like the super light.
They brought out this kind of new thing where I think their road uniforms for a bunch of years were gray. So they really only
I remember that
white or gray. And it was a total franchise remodel. And again, sometimes you can overstate it, but when we did the episode on Tampa sports, Dan, we talked about the Bucks, and it's like, even if you like those creamsicle uniforms, which I do, they become so synonymous with losing that it was probably necessary for an image makeover. And even though this isn't one that people really remember all that fondly, if they remember it at all, it was probably necessary as part of a franchise that was looking to put the recent past behind them. So I just wanted to mention that 97-98 team.
Oh yeah, was that around the time? So I'm trying to remember what year it was that they were holding a contest for when they were considering the rename, right? When they were basically like, hey, we're thinking about renaming the Nets. And because I remember reading this, I used to get the Star Ledger paper and used to read it, on the weekends, because that was like the local paper. And right, there was articles about, they're holding you could fill out a form and mail it in somewhere, right? Because there was no website to go to vote on back at that time, because it was very close. They were going to be the Swamp Dragons. It was very, very close. And I was like, well, that's dumb. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that?
I remember being on a trip, going somewhere, coming back from some trip with my family, and my dad had WFAN on, and they gave the 2020 sports update, and they said, officially announced, the New Jersey Nets have officially announced that they will change their name to the Swamp Dragons in 2000 or whatever, 1997 or whatever it was. I never really found out why they abandoned that. I mean, I
think everybody mocked them mercilessly, and then they were like, all right, we have to. I honestly, I think that was the undertone that I got from, that's what I remember of the time when they announced it, because because I definitely remember it being a done deal, and I even remember like seeing the mascot. Right, there was like
it was a logo mock-up.
yeah.
The thing it reminds me of is a couple of years before that, maybe even around, might have been right around then, the 49ers, the San Francisco 49ers announced they were changing their helmet, and whoever it was, Carmen Policy or whoever, actually did a press conference with the new helmet on the table, and you could see pictures of it, but the backlash was so severe that even though they announced it as a done deal, they just quietly backed off of it. And that's similar, I think, to what happened here, which is like, no, this is done. We're going forward. And then it was so negative that it was like, okay, never mind.
I think when you're the 49ers and you've won 5 Super Bowls recently at that point, you're talking mid-90s, the Montana years were not that long ago. You can do that and just sort of silently back away from it. When you're the Nets and you've been a laughingstock and all of a sudden you want to change your name to the Swamp Dragons, it's another reason why people don't take it seriously.
Yeah, I'm trying to think who even owned the team back then.
That's a good question. I don't know who who was the ownership of the team around that time. I don't even know who was. Let me look up here. Who the owners of the team were. Ownership. I know now they're kind of partially owned by that whole Yankees
Alibaba guy. Well, the Alibaba guy.
Well, they had Prokhorov.
Well, Prokhorov sold it to Tony Hsieh.
Yes,
who is the Alibaba CEO or something. I think he still owns the majority of it.
Yes.
He's the current owner. I didn't know how to pronounce his name. I thought it was Sai, but I'm obviously wrong.
Although that's not that crazy, Sai, because there's a building at BU that's got that same namesake, TSAI, and they pronounce it Sai. So
if you're looking, I'm going to kind of, so I talked about that 97-98 team. Then the next year, 98-99, you had Calipari leave. He was replaced by Don Casey.
Ah, yes.
And then I think the big thing about that year, if we're talking about team building, was that was the year that they traded Sam Cassell for Stephon Marbury.
Yeah, those were some. Yeah, I was never a big Stephon Marbury fan. Just didn't really care for him at all.
I was just saying, I know during that era, I think the last year he was there, he was known to, he was writing all alone on his sneakers at one point to kind of signify that he was the only guy on a bad team. We obviously had some experience with him as Knicks later on, and there was some good there, but it was fleeting. It's just interesting that Marbury was on each end, coming to the Nets and leaving the Nets, involved in trades for significant players. Obviously, the later trade is much more important, but being traded for Sam Cassell, who still after that had tons of good years left in him, is interesting.
Yeah, I remember when they had him. That was the year, and I guess the one thing I think we should mention before we transition right there is right around the same time period. I think maybe the season, Marbury's first year was 98-99. Right around that time is also when they hire Rod Thorne to run the team, who, if you don't know sort of NBA executives, Rod Thorne is maybe the best NBA executive of all time. He's the guy, he's the one who drafted Michael Jordan in 84, been an executive with the league. He's also been heavily involved with USA Basketball, but he's best known probably for running Knicks in those early years of the 2000s. And he's the one who makes some of these trades we'll talk about in a minute here. But you're right. Marbury was interesting because he was the star. He was an all-star for them in 2000, 2001, and he was kind of bringing a little bit of prominence to the team because Williams was gone, and it was several years since that Anderson Coleman. And I think in some ways he brought attention to the team by being such a malcontent, but he really was that last year, especially that whole, all alone 33 on the shoes. And I had my friend Troy, who was a big Nets fan. He and I used to always get in debates because he used to always try and convince me that Marbury was a lot better than I thought he actually was. This was the year, this 2000, 2001, that I know Andrew said the year, Marbury had been with the team for a couple of years, but Marbury's last year, 2000, 2001, that was the year they drafted Kenyon Martin. And
oh, yeah.
Because I think, Abe, as you sort of alluded to, they had made some bad draft choices. Tim Thomas in 1997, who I don't even know. Did Tim Thomas ever even play for the Nets? No, he was.
I don't know, but
he was part of the Van Horn trade, I think.
My Tim Thomas memories are always, well, that guy doesn't care, and then I would watch teams like pay him 7 years, $120 million contracts, and he would. Right, he was the definition of contract year player, right? He would play awesome in that contract year, and then he would get paid, and then he would not do anything else again. And then the contract year would come up, and he would be awesome, and everybody would be like, oh, he's really got it. Let's go ahead and give him a long-term deal. And this happened like 3 or 4. I watched this happen literally 3 or 4 times. I was like, why are you doing this to yourselves?
So they're so bad in 99, 2000 that they end up with the first overall draft pick, and that's when they draft Kenyon Martin. And that was a big deal. He had been a heck of a player. I believe that the Cincinnati team he was on had gone deep into they'd gone pretty deep into the tournament the year before. But Martin had broken his leg. That's right. Kenyon Martin had broken his leg, and then the Nets drafted him anyway. And that was the big question: is they're drafting this guy with a broken leg? Is he going to be able to be a solid pro, especially as a forward, a guy whose body takes a beating? But he ended up doing pretty well. But the year before that, like I said, that year, I guess, that 2000, 2001, that was Martin's rookie year. But that was still Marbury, and all the other pieces had kind of come into place a little bit, Kittles and Van Horn. But they also, this was the year my friends and I, we were able to get a deal where we were able to get 7 games for $60.
You guys got robbed.
But it was cool because you could basically pick the games. Mm-hmm. So we saw San Antonio, we saw Philly, with Iverson. That was the year they went to the finals. That was Iverson's MVP year. We saw the Celtics. Who else did we see? We saw the Magic with McGrady and Grant Hill, although Grant Hill was probably hurt. Vince Carter and the Raptors, that was another one we saw. So it was a really cool way to go see other teams when the Knicks were they were just at the end of their 10 years of being so dominant that you couldn't get a Knick ticket for less than $100, but you could go to 7 net games and see some of these same opposition teams for less than it would cost for 1 Knick game. So I took a lot of late night trips to New Jersey, to and from New Jersey, my senior year of high school. And
did you drive out, or did you take the bus? Like, how'd you get there?
We drove. My friend would drive. Yeah.
Okay.
This was also a team that had Johnny Newman, who was 14 years in the league. They had Sherman Douglas, and I'll never forget going to the game against the Sixers and watching Sherman Douglas try and guard Allen Iverson. And the guys like three rows behind me, all of a sudden one of the guys just yells out, "Yo, Sherman Douglas is on skates out there." And then that was only my second favorite of that night. Johnny Newman comes in, and these kids were like our age. They're like 17. And one of the kids yells out, "Yo, Johnny Newman been in the league 25 years." So, good memories of those teams, but and kind of maybe set the table a little bit, even though the 1-loss record wasn't the same. And this was Byron Scott's first year as coach, so they got Scott, they got Rod Thorne, they got Kenyon Martin as their first overall draft choice, and then they're able to make this trade for Kidd, which I don't know exactly why Kidd was so eager to get out of Phoenix. I think that. Oh,
wait, was Kidd in Phoenix at that time?
Kidd was in Phoenix, yeah.
Well, wasn't there I can't remember if this is when he had trouble with the drinking before. If this was before or after that came out. I can't remember.
That could be right. I think that might have been part of like trying to get him into a new atmosphere and a new situation.
Yeah. Because I know he went to Phoenix after the Triple J's broke up in Dallas, right? Jamal Mashburn, Jimmy Jackson, and Jason Kidd. I believe Tony Braxton was involved in that somehow. I still don't know the full story, but
she unbroke somebody's heart.
Yeah, exactly. I love Tony Braxton. I had a huge crush on her growing up. So
apparently, you weren't the only one.
So I'm reading his last year with the Suns. It talks about Kidd. 2000-2001 season was affected by Kidd's personal problems. He was charged with domestic abuse of his wife. Kidd took more of the offensive up. That's just about the offense, but made the All-Star game. So yeah, that was a big part of it. Personal issues, and they had also acquired Penny Hardaway.
That's right.
expecting that to be them to coexist a little better than they did that year on the, not personally, but more on the court.
On the court.
So,
Was Sarver did Sarver still own the team back then? Or I don't know how long he's owned that team.
I don't know. Maybe I could look that up, but yeah, I can look that up.
Speaking of terrible owners.
So they bring in Kidd, and they end up having this just under Byron Scott. They just have this out of nowhere year in 01-02. They go 52-30. They're first in the Atlantic. I don't know where they were in the conference, but they were seated pretty high. They might have been the number 1 overall seed. Kidd's great. Richard Jefferson's coming into his own.
A young Richard Jefferson, man.
Mm-hmm.
He was so good. He was so good.
The Kidd Marbury trade was the day after the draft. The night before that, they had traded Eddie Griffin to Houston.
Oh, man.
Richard Jefferson and Jason Collins. And Jason Collins was a role player on those, next couple of teams.
Yeah, Jason Collins was a solid big.
Jason Collins obviously becomes known as the first openly gay player in the NBA. And so I think, and certainly not a guy whose playing legacy is anything to write home about, but this is he plays in the league forever. He doesn't leave. Abe and I remember him. He played 6 games.
Played for the Wizards.
6 games.
Wizards.
12-13.
He also has a twin brother who was also in the NBA.
Jaron Collins, right?
Jaron Collins, yeah.
The thing I remember about Jason Collins is 2 things about 12 years apart. When they made it to the finals that year in 01, I guess it would have been 02, they had 3 centers. They had Collins, they had Todd McCullough,
oh man,
and then they had Aaron Williams, who was sort of a forward center. But he was, for most of the season, Aaron Williams was McCullough's backup. And of the 3, and I don't know why they didn't put Kenyon Martin on Shaq more. Maybe they did, and I just don't remember.
Well, they did. They did put Kenyon Martin on Shaq. I remember those finals. I'm pretty certain that Kenyon Martin being the tallest player on the Nets out on the floor. They couldn't put anybody else out there.
And I just remember thinking that Collins, of all of them, was the one who did better than, maybe not Kenyon, but Collins did better on the other 2 than either the other 2. And, Collins was the rookie, so you didn't necessarily expect him to be able to guard Shaq. And then my other Jason Collins story, or not my story, but when he came back after he had come out as gay, and, obviously there was all this attention on him playing, one of his first games, he played like 8 minutes, scored 0 points, and fouled out. I just remember saying, like, obviously, and rightfully so, this is going to be eclipsed by the groundbreaking nature of this, but how often does a guy foul out with no points in 8 minutes?
It's pretty incredible. It's pretty incredible. That was when he was on the Wizards, but who were they playing that he was able to foul out quite so quickly?
No, I think it was when he was on the Nets. It was when he came back with the Nets.
Okay, when he came back with the Nets. Okay.
So that was an interesting team, and then, but it really just came out of nowhere. I mean, a lot of people thought Kidd should have been the MVP that year. They gave it to Tim Duncan, but I remember people were disappointed. They thought that because Kidd was having, and this was a time when, you really hadn't had a point guard win an MVP since Magic. It had all been, either Jordan or I guess Iverson had won the year before, but he wasn't really a pure point guard. Iverson had won the year before in 01. So they really wanted to see, people wanted to see Kidd win the MVP, but it didn't happen. But then they go on this run, they go to the finals, and I think that year, I don't think anybody expected them to beat the Lakers, and they just got smashed.
They got steamrolled. They had no one to guard Shaq at all.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It just was not even. It wasn't even a contest, really. I mean, I was expecting them. Honestly, I thought they might win 1 game just because. Right, because didn't Philly won 1 game, and I was like, okay, they can at least take 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
Allen Iverson went off for 51 or something like that, and they took a game, and I was like, okay. I was like, look, the Nets aren't winning this series. Like, let's just not even think that's happening. Meteor would have to, strike the arena, and they would have to, play the towel guys for that to be a possibility. But I thought they could win a game, and they did not at all. And I don't even remember them being close. Right, I'm pretty certain I watched very little of the second half of those games.
I seem to vaguely remember there being 1 game where they were all of a sudden, it was sometime in the third quarter, and they were hanging with them. It was like, oh, they might make a game of it.
I remember there was 1 game. Kenyon Martin did go off 1 game, and I was and when that happened, I was thinking, all right, maybe this is the game they win, and that just didn't have enough. I feel like Kenyon Martin scored like 40-something points and no one else could hit a shot.
And I think the timing of this was good for them too, because the Knicks, this was the first year the Knicks had missed the playoffs since I think since before Patino in like 87. So not that it was a replacement, but for people like me who were NBA fans and wanted to root for a New York team, and all of a sudden you got this Nets team going all the way to the finals. I think that was kind of exciting for some people. Andrew didn't agree, I don't think.
No, that first year I liked that team. I think the other thing to point out, a couple of things, was they played such a different style. They ran so much compared to what basketball was in that, at that point, with a lot of isolations and things like that. I remember for a while when they would do their introductions, it might have been the next year in the finals, but they played like the beginning of Born to Run by Springsteen, obviously the Jersey thing, but it really matched up with how they played, obviously Kid being the impetus behind all of that. And they really did kind of take, I don't want to say the NBA, because realistically the Kings and the Lakers that year was the big series in the Western Conference, but Kid also had the thing where he would do the blow and the kiss, the free throw.
When he did the free throws, yeah.
Son, who was adorable. That was very, it really, his wife and kid really became part of the story as those playoffs went on and as they had that Eastern Conference Finals against the Celtics and all that. And this was probably at the height of winning the East meant you were the fifth or sixth best team in the NBA, but it also meant you got to the NBA Finals. You were one of the last teams playing. So phenomenon is probably a little too strong, but it was a huge national story as the year went on.
It was a moment. It was a moment.
The Nets are good. Now the Nets are really good, and now they're also living up to the hype in the playoffs. It was, it was a force of nature, I guess you could say.
And that rivalry with the Celtics really brought a lot home for that. And that was a rivalry that got really nasty, because it was the Nets on the one side, and then this was the Antoine Walker, Paul Pierce, Kenny Anderson Celtics. That was the year 2002 was the year that the Nets blew something like a 25-point lead in the fourth quarter of a game in the conference finals. And I remember going to one of those games I went to a playoff game. I went to game one of that conference finals in Jersey. And then the following year in Boston, when I was in college, I went to just a regular season Nets Celtics games, and it was intense. Like, people saying things about Kidd, people saying things about Pierce. This was an intense rivalry. And obviously, you kind of had the whole New York-Boston angle to the whole thing. But for a couple of years, it's one of those rivalries that kind of faded really quick. But that Nets-Celtics rivalry for those couple of years was pretty intense. And I think when the Celtics traded Walker after the 2003 season, it kind of really started to recede. But for those couple of years, it was intense.
It was pretty intense, because I remember going to a few games when the Nets would come to town. I would, and if it was in college, we would go get cheap tickets and, go. And it was, yeah, like you said, intense. Right? The atmosphere was very, very, very charged.
So obviously, as Abe said, one of their big issues is that they can't guard Shaq in the finals. So they go ahead and they make this trade in the offseason. They bring in Dikembe Mutombo, and they trade Van Horn and McCullough. Not McCullough, I'm sorry. Or is it McCullough? Now, who do they trade for Mutombo?
McCullough was in that trade.
No, they traded. Wasn't Mutombo coming from Denver? So that would have been Martin, right?
No, Mutombo was coming from Philly.
Yeah, I have it.
Oh, I'm thinking later. Okay.
Yeah.
Van Horn and McCullough to the Sixers for Mutombo. I can maybe figure out the exact players. I can look it up. But that
was the trade. I just looked it up. That was it. It was just those three guys. And the crazy thing is, and the reason I was confused a little bit about McCullough was McCullough had just been on the Sixers.
I think him and Van Horn got traded for each other twice.
Well, they got traded. Yeah, there's something really strange about the whole McCullough, because McCullough was on the Iverson team that lost to the Lakers. Then he was on the Nets for a year.
So he signed with the Nets he was drafted by Philly. He signed as a free agent with the Nets in 2001.
And they traded him right back to Philly.
Back to the Philly in a year later.
Jeez. And now he is like a huge collector of pinball machines.
Good for him.
Oh,
He has,
that's weird.
He has one of the largest pinball machine collections in the. I think it was actually might have even been located in D.C. I'll have to look that up. It was very strange.
Huh.
So this probably is the team that I think was the best. They weren't quite as good in the regular season in 02-03, but
Yeah.
now Mutombo ends up being hurt for most of the year, and Aaron Williams is gone too. So if you want to talk about Jason Collins sort of ends up being, or I guess Williams is still there. I'm sorry, but Jason Collins ends up being sort of the starting center for most of the year. He kind of, when Mutombo gets hurt, he steps into that role. Mutombo only plays in 24 games. He only starts 16, and by the time they make the playoffs, Mutombo's very much sort of in the background. But this 02-03 team, this was probably the best team they had. They really gave the Spurs a run for their money in the finals. They were leading in the second half of Game 6. Now, I still think they probably lose to San Antonio in Game 7, but to me, this is the team that was the one that was the closest to being able to win a championship.
Yeah, this would have been, this was one of their best, this was their best team, right? Even though they had all the injuries, they had another year. They were really playing well. I think they matched up reasonably well with San Antonio at the time.
Yeah.
Because, Tim Duncan is, greatest power forward of all time, but he's not as overpowering as Shaq was.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, Shaq demands a force of nature. He's like, okay, he's, 7'3", 300 and some odd pounds and can basically do whatever he wants with you. Tim Duncan had a little more finesse to his game, and so you could actually sort of take him off the block and push him out a little more. But San Antonio is better coached. What are you going to say, right?
Well, that's true. And I think that Kidd started having issues with Byron Scott right around this time.
Yep.
Yeah, and a couple of thoughts on that. So that whole finals is weird as well because Jason Kidd is about to be a free agent.
That's right.
The Nets are considered at the time a small market team, even though they play a small budget, I guess would be a better way to describe it. And not only is he about to be a free agent, people are saying he's probably going to end up on the Spurs.
That's right.
Playing this team in the finals. The difference sort of in the playoffs this year was the Nets were a 2 seed, but they got hotter as the playoffs went on. They beat Milwaukee in 6 in the first round. That was the first year of the 7-game first round. Then they swept Boston in the second round. They swept Detroit in the Eastern Conference Finals. And then they go into this finals against a team that is trying to poach their best player. And also, just as kind of an aside, it's a very different situation, but the spring of 1994 in New York looms large because the Rangers and Knicks were playing in the finals at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing happened in 2003. At the same time the Nets are playing the Spurs, the Devils were playing the Anaheim Mighty Ducks in the Stanley Cup Finals. So just a little bit of a...
And you know what's interesting about that too is that, and I don't think you'll ever see this again, both series were on the same network. They were both on ABC.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I don't think you'll see that ever again. They divvy them up.
Was that ABC's first year with basketball, I think?
It was ABC's first year with basketball, and they had hockey then too, because I remember watching the basketball game, and they had the hockey announcers come to they were all in Jersey, and they had them all on the set in the arena at halftime saying, "Oh, tomorrow you'll check out the Devils in the Stanley Cup Finals."
The next year was the hockey lockout. And after that, ESPN and also ABC hasn't had any hockey. That's changing next year, but ever since then, they haven't had any hockey. So
they lose to the Spurs, and then everybody thinks Kidd is gone, and they are able to convince Kidd to stay. And one of the reasons they are able to convince him to stay is that they bring in another star to sort of compliment him and try and build the next team. They sign a free agent. Does anybody remember who that was?
Looking over the roster, and I have to say it is Alonzo Mourning.
Alonzo Mourning. I remember people being pumped when they made this move.
I liked Alonzo Mourning coming out of college. I really enjoyed him on, he was drafted by the Charlotte Hornets, which were just, top 2 all-time color scheme, right?
Yep.
He had some great years there. At this point, he was how old, though? That's sort of what I'm trying to remember.
He was 33, and he was just coming off missing a whole season with his kidney disease.
There you go. That's right. I was wondering if that was when that had happened. Yeah.
And so the signing was a little bit risky, but I think it was pretty well understood that he was probably going to be able to play. And then he only played 12 games in that season. And I think that part of it was because of his illness, but I also just remember there being a really strong vibe of he doesn't really want to be here. And so here we go. He retired right after they signed him.
Oh.
He retired in November of 2003.
That's right.
Kid must have been thrilled. He signs with the Nets when he could have gone to San Antonio, and he does it probably largely on the basis that they're going to bring in Mourning, and then Mourning retires. But then Mourning sort of starts to he starts practicing again with the team in 2004, 2005. And then, here's the thing, November 24th. I'm thinking October 24th for Mourning, which is right before the season. November 24th, that explains why he's got 12 games. He played 12 games and then retired.
And then he retired.
That's even tougher. Oh, my God.
I mean, was that medical related, or was he
it was his kidneys.
It had to be his kidneys, right?
It was his kidneys, yeah. It was his kidneys. And then he comes back, he starts practicing with them again. And this is when he really becomes sort of a malcontent. And he starts complaining. They trade Kenyon Martin. He gets upset about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so he kind of stops putting in much effort on the Nets. And meanwhile, north of the border, Vince Carter has kind of given up on the Raptors. And
literally,
he was really bad. I mean, as bad as whatever Mourning did, Carter had really sort of...
Carter, where he was at a concert or something when he was supposed to be on the road with the team, and he didn't go because he was supposedly hurt or something. I feel like I remember that.
I mean, he just straight up dogged it until they traded him, right? He was like, trade me, and then proceeded to play his way out of town, literally.
He kind of invented that. Yeah, and the only guy who I can think of who maybe did something similar a little bit in the 90s was Barkley, where Barkley made it very clear that he did not want to be in Philly anymore and kind of forced their hand into trading. But, the James Harden strategy of I'm just going to not put in any effort until they trade me. I remember Carter being kind of one of the first guys that really did that. But when they made that trade, that was like a big deal. That was supposed to be sort of, here come the Nets. This is going to be this Kidd and Carter thing is going to be the next big two. And then it just never really pans out. They make the playoffs the next few years, but they never go past the second round. And then 2003, 2004, even after having won or having been to 2 straight finals, this is when the conflicts between Kidd and Byron Scott come into play, and then they bring in Lawrence Frank. And
that guy.
Lawrence Frank's got an interesting story, too, because Kidd coached the Nets for 1 year, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And Lawrence Frank was his assistant.
Yep. And there were rumors going around that Lawrence Frank was out for his job, and so he would make him there was a website that got created. I don't know if you remember this.
I do remember this, yeah.
It was like Lawrence Frank's write-up, and so the running joke with Kidd was making him go pick up Arby's insteed of being an assistant coach or something so that he wouldn't take his job.
They kicked him off the bench after 3 games. They were like, okay, you're not going to be on the bench during the games. You're going to go off and do, write-ups.
Special assignments, I think it was.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was just the whole thing. And then, of course, Kidd proved to be what he was, and he left the team after a year anyway. So the whole era kind of dies out with the signing of Mourning, and then later with the trade for Carter, especially in what was a weak Eastern Conference. I think everybody maybe would have expected them to go a little bit deeper, but it just doesn't happen. And then by this point, you start to get Detroit, gets really good. Detroit's in the Eastern Conference Finals every year for like 6 years in a row or something like that. And
in the '04 offseason, Kittles and Martin are both traded. Lucius Harris is released obviously Van Horn was gone, McCullough is gone. So it's really outside of Kidd, who's left from that core. Kidd and Richard Jefferson.
I mean, Jefferson is like those two are the only guys left who can actually play still. And I mean, by that point, Kittles had blown out his knee, and he wasn't nearly as good as he was, and as he had been in the past. And Jeff Van Horn was always underwhelmed. Not Jeff Van Horn, Keith Van Horn was always underwhelming to me, and he just never. I always thought that he should be better than he was, and he just never was.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree with that. Yeah, and so that's kind of end of it. They really sort of hit the tank in the later years, the later Jersey years, and then 12-70 in 09-10, which is I think like their second or third to last year in Jersey. And this is the year where this 09-10 team.
I'm looking at this team and it is just wait, is this no, they didn't. Good Lord, they had Yiji Lan on that team.
That's right.
The chairman himself. Oh, man. But he was I'm like, that's a Bucks first round pick, right? I was like, they didn't draft him. They draft.
Lawrence Frank is still the coach.
Yeah.
He starts off 0-16. So they lose at least their first 18 games this season because Frank is 0-16. And then this guy, Tom Barise, who they get to replace him, is 0-2.
He was an assistant coach. He was an assistant coach.
They're at least 0-18 to start the season. And then they really don't do much until they get to Brooklyn. And their first year in Brooklyn, they're decent. And then they make the trade for Pierce Garnett and Jason Terry. So, yeah, I mean, really, once the Carter trade is made, they've got a couple of years, and then it kind of.
And then they're irrelevant. They're essentially irrelevant after that.
It's interesting to me, and now, I mean, it's just crazy. It's they started the season this year with just Durant and Kyrie.
Yep.
Now they have Harden.
Yeah.
They have Blake Griffin, and they got Drummond from.
No, they didn't
Pistons.
get Drummond. They got
Who am I thinking of?
LaMarcus Aldridge.
Oh, they got Aldridge. That's who they got. There was talk of Drummond, but they got LaMarcus Aldridge instead. That's right. So it'll be interesting to see. I also think it'll be interesting, and this is such an atypical year with all the COVID stuff. There's some fans back. Maybe by the time the NBA finals come around, there'll be more fans back. So I'm curious to see what sort of the New York attention. Obviously, a team like that will get national attention. They'll be on ESPN and everything, but I'll be curious to see whether this team with all of these big superstars gets any real attention in the New York media when you consider the fact that the kid teams never really did even though that year they had Pierce and Garnett, they never really did. Andrew, was the year that the Nets had Pierce and Garnett, was that the year the Knicks were good too? Was that the year they won 50 games? I think it was, right? Or was it the year before? It was the year before.
It might have been. Yeah, so it was just 1 year with them. But I think it was, because they were playing, I want to say that was the year they got to the second, no, they lost in the first round that year to the Heat, I want to say. And then the Knicks lost in the second round, because I don't think they were both in the second round at the same time. Or no, it was the year after, because the Knicks beat the Celtics. That was Garnett and Pierce's last year with the Celtics, because that was kind of the end of the Celtics. So they would have been traded the next year.
Yeah, that was 12-13. You're right. The Knicks beat the Celtics. And then 13-14 was the year all those guys went to Brooklyn.
Yeah, so what I'll say, living in New York at the moment, I mean, I don't live in New York City, but I live in the New York media market. Certainly, if they get to the Eastern Conference Finals, they will be getting a ton of local attention. Mm-hmm. Objectively, it'll be July or June. It'll be late June, given the way the season's going this year. In terms of you have baseball. Baseball dominates the market in this city when it's baseball season. So the Yankees and the Mets. By then, you would imagine everyone else, the Rangers will be gone, the Knicks will be gone. Still a couple of weeks away from the start of NFL camps. They will get as much attention as they're capable of getting, and I think more than they even did in the early 2000s because of how much the media market has changed.
Yeah.
It's not about Mike Lupica's column in the Daily News anymore.
This is one thing I've always been curious about. Right, so when the Nets essentially moved to Brooklyn, I was like, all right, I'm sort of 1 foot out the door, and then I moved to DC, and I was like, all right, we're definitely done. Do people consider the Nets to be a New York team now, or what are the Nets considered in New York?
The Nets were always when people talk about New York, they say there's 9 sports teams. 9 pro sports teams because there's 2 football, 2 baseball. The Devils have always counted as a New York team. The Nets wherever the Nets have played, they've counted as a New York team.
Mm-hmm.
The Nets, it's very hard, and I don't want to get too granular with it like I'm some sort of expert, but the Nets are a New York team, but they are still very much second-class citizens, and I know what the Knicks are. I know if the Knicks were 9-60 this year, there might be a little bit of more, but I think the Nets probably get a lot more national attention than they do local attention right now because they play in Brooklyn. They're a New York team, but it's also not a team that's come together that people have been watching for years. They've been watching these guys for years, but on other teams. So there's almost no reason to cover them from a local angle. They just cover them from a national angle. And they've also tried so hard to differentiate themselves from every other sports team by being borough specific. So if the Nets win a championship this year, God forbid, I will guarantee, and let's say COVID is gone. Let's take COVID out of the equation for a second. I guarantee you the parade will not be down the Canyon of Heroes in Manhattan.
It'll be a Brooklyn thing.
Nets will want to have it in Brooklyn. So
I see.
It's a hybrid. It's weird. They're certainly more popular than, the Devils were when the Devils were winning championships and all of that. But radio stations around here do say, if we open up the phones and say we're going to take calls about the 2 local basketball teams, 8 of 10 of those calls are about the Knicks.
Yeah.
Rightfully or wrongly, whatever that proves, but anecdotally, that is still this tenor of the town in terms of basketball and the fandom.
Durant probably got a lot more play for his Twitter beef with
Michael Rappaport.
By the time this airs, it'll be over a month ago. But, as we're recording, it's recent, than anything that any one Net has done on the court. And part of that's just the NBA landscape, but there's really not such a thing as the Nets have a big game tonight. And I think, like Andrew said, that probably won't roll out until the conference finals. So I'm very curious to sort of do the counterfactual of if this team was around 2 years ago before COVID, what would it be like? But so much of the media landscape has changed because of COVID. So there's kind of there's 2 variables there. But yeah, my other question sort of that I don't know the answer to is I wonder who goes to the games, because I feel like Knicks have a lot of people in normal times, people coming in from where we're from or from Long Island, they take the train right in, they go to the game. But then it's also the thing to do, business people and people getting boxes or they have company seats. I'm curious who goes to the Brooklyn Nets games. My suspicion is that it's probably a lot of New Yorkers who come from other cities who go to see their teams play.
Yeah.
Well,
Sort of like what we get with the Nationals. I always used to say you can tell who the Nationals are playing that weekend just by riding the Metro at rush hour on a Friday. It's very clear. So my guess is that's a part of it too with the Nets.
And I think there's a lot of people who live in New York who, if they're going to pick a team, they've picked the Nets. They're not from New York. They might have come in with no prior allegiances, or they might have come in with a team. Now, obviously, if you're a Celtics fan or a Sixers fan or something else, but if you moved to New York from Indiana and you were a Pacers fan, but only nominally, or an Orlando Magic fan or something, I think a lot of those people are getting on the Nets, but, and not to me, I know this wasn't the focus of the podcast, but I think by virtue of the way they've built this team, which is smart, but it's not, I think there's a lot, and it's probably also a factor of the Knicks being better this year. There's not a lot of people who are like, I couldn't take it anymore with the Knicks, and now I'm a Nets fan. There are some.
Yeah, I just don't see that.
Yeah,
like being a huge factor. I am curious to what happens after. Right, I just don't see the three. Right, I don't see Durant, Harden, or Kyrie there long term. So like like you said, it's smart to have those big names to like draw fans there now. But when they're gone, what do they have?
And modern sports are like that in a lot of ways, where it's always a different team every year. But you're both right. They keep reinventing themselves so much. It's like even since they've been in Brooklyn, it was like they had the Joe Johnson year, and then they had the Pierce Allen I keep saying Allen, the Pierce Garnett year, and then they had something else. And it was Brooke Lopez was big, and then a couple years ago they finally started with some of these guys, D'Angelo Russell and some of these guys. It was this up and coming team, and now it's a totally different thing. It's the new Heat where everybody just goes there,
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to root for laundry, but usually there's like at least one guy on the team they draft, right?
And that's, I think, a lot of what they lost with all the trades they made this year. So, all right, well, this was a great conversation, a topic that we hadn't really delved into too much. Really, like I said, not much at all in our first 25 or so episodes. I'd like to thank Abe for joining us. Did you have anything to add before we wrapped it up?
No, but we should definitely do this for the Wizards as well, because there's some great stuff there.
Yeah, let's absolutely do that. We will absolutely do that at some point in the coming months. Andrew, anything from you?
No, if we do that episode, we should have an actual Wizard on as well.
I'll grow my beard out and dye it white.
That's right. All right. Well, for Abe Evans-El, our guest, thank you so much for joining us. And Andrew and I will be back again with another exciting sports topic next time around. Until that time, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.